It like to be a politician? That's my pitch question for today's video. And I think it's an interesting subject because it's something I think very, very, very few people really give a lot of thought to. Now, for the purpose of this, I'm going to restrict it to the UK context. And I invite people around the world to ask the same question about what it is to be like a politician in their country. Now, this pitch question shouldn't be misunderstood. This is to say let's all kind of sympathize with politicians because there are many, many, many examples of corruption and, let's say areas critique is absolutely legitimate. But I do think that it's something that we need to examine in this country because I think a lot of people are very quick to rush to judgment about those who fundamentally have enormous responsibility on their hands. So, for the purpose of this, I'm going to take an average level politician. I'm not going to focus at the very top and I'm not going to focus at the bottom of the hierarchy of political levels. So, the very bottom would be a county level councillor or a city level councillor, a councillor basically. That's a it's a part time basis, at least that's the theory. They do get paid, but it's only on a part time basis. I believe the figure £7,000 a year. So certainly not reflecting a full-time job. And there is certainly responsibility involved, but it's low level. Altogether, I believe we have somewhere in the region of 7,000 councillors. Actually, I don't know what the exact figure is, but I believe it's in the thousands. Um, and you're basically tasked with representing your party at a local division of a city or a county council level. That's an area I've personal experience of because I have ran as a city councillor twice. I didn't succeed. I didn't get enough votes, but I ran twice for that position. So it's a level I have some degree of knowledge about. Um, Actually, I will include that in the video because there are some actual points that I'd like wider public to consider, but also parliamentary level. Okay, so starting at the council level. One thing I've always considered must be difficult is if you are representing a minority party. Let's say you're representing, if for example, you're in a city, I'll give Sunderland as an example where I live. This is a very strong Labour city. So the chances are, and by the way, these are not real life circumstances, just to give an example, that's all. If you are a Green or a UKIP or a Liberal Democrats or an Independent, or even a Conservative in a city like this, it's going to be very difficult to get a great deal done. Conservative a little bit more so because there are several Conservative councillors. But if you represent a party where there may only be one councillor out of, in the case of Sunderland, 65, realistically, you're in a very difficult position because you have represented the party because you believe in its ideology and its, at least ostensibly you do, believe in its target, its ideology, and you have campaigned on that you are representing as. I'll put it another way so that I don't seem like I'm giving a real world example too much. Let's say Party A. Let's just give an example, right? Let's say a particular council has 100 councillors. Now, let's say Party A has 92 councillors, so they have an overwhelming majority of the council. Let's say Party B has, I don't know, 4 councillors. Let's say the remaining parties have 1 councillor each. Now, realistically, it's going to be extremely difficult, even for Party B, to get a great deal done, because how can 4 councillors go against 96 councillors? And this is something I think the public need to understand. So sometimes when you have a minority party, and I wonder do the public sometimes vote on that regard, they think, oh, well, they're not going to get anything done anyway, so we'll vote for the majority party. That may be the case. Also, sometimes a generational thing, people vote for whoever the parents vote for. But when you have that situation, it's a really difficult job to get things done. And I think the only thing that could really be done is try and reach some areas of compromise. So when you are representing Party D and you're sitting around the council table and everyone else is in the majority Party A, and you're thinking, I don't agree with what they're saying, that this is wrong. The most you can hope for is by voicing your opinion, which takes actually a little bit of pluck because you're in a minority and it's never to speak from a minority perspective in any context in life. Um, so yeah, that's something I think people need to sort of consider. But also, I would say anyone who wants to get into politics also needs to consider that aspect. How are you going to handle if you are in a minority, knowing that there's very little you could get done? I think one area could be trying to kind of be friendly with people on the outside. I'm not talking about blackmailing people or anything like that. That's the wrong term. But being on a friendly enough basis, not friend in a social sense, but amicable. You know, you get on fine with people. You have a decent relationship and saying, okay, I disagree with you on this area, but you think we can find some common ground on this area? I saw a film, it was a biographic of the American city controller of San Francisco, Harvey Milk, who's kind of become the Martin Luther King and his gay rights. In fact, a US Navy ship is going to be named in his honor. In that film, they show how his ultimate assassin actually, there was this kind of areas where they would speak to each other, and ostensibly, up until towards the end of the film, they get on quite well. Now, obviously, that's an extreme example because Harvey Milk was assassinated. But the point I'm making is they came from different political backgrounds. I believe Harvey Milk stood as a Democrat, and I believe his assassin was something else. I don't know. I'm not 100% sure about that. But in UK council level, it's pretty much the same thing. It's a constant question of compromise. Now, raising the bar a little bit to parliamentary level, this is where an MP represents an entire constituency, which could be anywhere from the smaller constituencies of probably 80,000 people upwards to 170,000. They do vary. We have 650 MPs, members of parliament. The nearest American equivalent would be senators, although it's not exactly an equivalent, but that would probably be the nearest comparison. Actually, congressmen might be a closer comparison. I'm not sure. But 650 MPs, now the UK has 65 million people. That makes the math quite easy. That means approximately one MP for every 100,000 people. So it's not a standard job, it's not a common job by any stretch of the imagination. Um, One thing is that with an MP, it is a full time job. It's true there are some MPs who have other jobs, but essentially it is a full time job, and rightfully the public expect MPs to treat it like a full time job. Um, Often MPs who are perceived not being doing the load basically and not meeting their constituents enough, um, often lose a seat after 4 or 5 years, whatever the parliamentary cycle is. We now have fixed term parliament, so it's every 5 years. Um, in theory, actually, around the world, British MPs hold regular surgeries. This is not something that is done even in other democracies. I believe the American equivalent is town hall meetings. In the UK, which can be quite a rough and tumble affair, it's basically a shouting match. In the UK, a surgery is basically when people they have some issue that they want to raise, so they contact the local MP's office and they say, "Can I arrange an appointment?" Just like anything else, like you're going to the dentist or you're arranging an appointment with an optician, whatever it may be. Then they go to the MP and they just discuss whatever the issue is. The MP probably then says what is within their power to do, and they will say, "I'll try my best to address this." And then we have weekly Prime Minister's questions. And it isn't just for PMQs, there's also many other events where MPs could basically raise. There's basically, obviously, not all 650 MPs can ask questions in every single session. But what they will do is, and I'm not sure exactly how this works, but they lobby the speaker in order to have their turn to raise a question. So they will then raise the question like, my constituents are concerned about this proposal. Will the minister assure me of X, Y, and Z? And that's pretty much how it goes. Sometimes they can make assurances, sometimes they can't. What the public need to understand is an MP only has so much power. MPs are in a powerful position and they're making decisions for thousands of people, but that power isn't absolute. They do have a limit on how much they can do. And I mentioned, local council level, if you're in a minority party, it's difficult to get everything done. It's the same if you're not in government. If you are the opposition party, which at present is the Labour Party, in Labour seats, the way government funding is allocated, in theory, shouldn't be party by party. It should be, they should be serving the whole country, regardless of whether a seat is Conservative or Labour or whatever. But in reality, I think there's definitely politics that gets played out, and there's definitely a certain degree of looking at constituencies like, can we win this in 5 years? It shouldn't be that way. It should simply be a case of serving the people. But the truth is, there is that power aspect to it. Like, can we win this in 5 years from now, and so on. But to actually be a politician, firstly, it's the only job where you could be fired on national television. I can't think of any other position where someone actually loses their job, possibly some sports positions, possibly some high level business positions. But really, I can't think of any other job where you have to literally stand there and wait to hear your fate. And sometimes it's justified, sometimes an MP deserves to lose his or her seat because they have abandoned the people and they have been involved in some big scandal or whatever. And then, well, that's that. The people have made the judgment. But there are times when there is an ascendancy of a particular party. And a very good example of this, in my opinion, is what happened with the SNP in Scotland. They done very well in the general election last year, so they swept the board basically. Now, a byproduct of that, and one example many people quoted, was the fate of Douglas Alexander. This was a man who had dedicated his life to public service. He had been a shadow foreign secretary and shadow numerous other positions. He'd held ministerial positions in the Brown government, and he was defeated by a 21-year-old who had zero political experience, except I think she'd had some council experience. Now, to be fair to Mary Black, she did. She was very sportsmanlike in her conduct. She was very, she credited Douglas Alexander with serving the constituency and so on. But that's a good example of how I don't think people were necessarily voting against Douglas Alexander. They were voting against Labour. And all over the country, there were similar circumstances. The same thing happened to the Liberal Democrats. Now, that I'm not aligned to either party, and I take many issues with both parties. Um, I'm very centrist, and in some areas I'm centre right, and these are both centre left parties. And in the case of Labour, quite hard left. In the case of the Liberal Democrats, they espouse some of the progressive politics that gets right on my nerves. But having said that, I believe that there are individual MPs who didn't deserve to lose their seat, and that's a good example of how sometimes you're just on you pick up the thin straw. You are on the thin end of the wedge. You are, you get the shit end of the stick, whatever metaphor you want to use. And that's unfortunate. That's why politics really is a brutal business. And unlike the world of sport, where the public generally, I mean, particularly Olympics, for example, if you get a British runner who does very, very well, but they don't quite get to the bronze level position, people are generally very hospitable, and that's right. That's a good thing. They're very much, oh, well, you tried your best, well done, and so on. When a politician actually does campaign hard, and they are actually a good constituency MP, they try their best, the public can be quite brutal. And it's like, oh, they're all in it for themselves, and that really gets on my nerves. I really think that's just laziness on the part of the public. Certainly, there's examples of that, but I think it's just lazy to dismiss all 650 MPs that way. Certainly, there are MPs who absolutely deserve the scorn that they get, because they are very Machiavellian type figures who, yeah, they are pretty shifty and are in it for themselves. And we have to remember that the policies that MPs make does impact other people. So I suppose that's the difference with the sporting example I just gave. A sports person doesn't. It's entirely about what they do for themselves. When an MP makes a decision, it affects other people. So that is a difference. Nevertheless, I think the public need to understand the dynamics of politics a little bit more. I'm not saying like feel sorry for MPs, but I'm just saying you need to appreciate that sometimes the public have a slightly childish attitude to it. It's like, give us everything we want, otherwise, you know, Otherwise, you're just in it for yourself. I don't think it's that simple. I think sometimes MPs really do. I honestly believe people can not call me naive if they want, but I honestly believe the majority of people get into politics for the right reason. I'm not saying everyone, but I believe the majority have their heart in the right place. They see problems in society, they want to do something about it. That's not to say that there are MPs I, you know, don't dislike, because there is. There's MPs I cannot stand, and I cringe every time I hear them speak. Um, but ultimately, as a general rule, people say they're in it for themselves. But then the follow up question is, well, what are they getting from it? Financially, it's not lucrative, really, not compared to certain other endeavours. Yes, it's a comfortable amount of money. In my opinion, it's about the right amount. MPs get, I believe, the figure is 65,000 a year. Might be a little bit more now. That's very comfortable. I believe, given the scrutiny they face, given the responsibility they have, I think it's about right. And I know many people would disagree with that. But, it's not so much a case that when people compare like MPs to nurses or to soldiers or other professions that really do put themselves out there, I think that's misguided. I think what people should be doing is saying those professions need to be paid more. It's not a case that MPs should be paid less. If anyone should be paid less, it's top bankers and footballers. Um, you know, in terms of being lucrative, I really don't think that it is the most lucrative of professions. In terms of fame, well, politicians, people focus on the negative. They very rarely give politicians credit for areas they do actually do good things and make good policies. So again, is it really a case of it when people say they're in it for themselves? And if it's a case of trying to get to the top, well, only a very select number of people can get into cabinet level. And very often you get people who are. I remember Harold Macmillan said he didn't like to see his Knight of the Long Knives as a purge, as firing people. He didn't like that term, but that's essentially what he done. He called it a reshuffle and moving people around. But essentially, that's what it is. When a prime minister has a reshuffle, inevitably people lose their position, and sometimes it's for the right, sometimes it's not right. I mean, obviously, it's the discretion of the prime minister. But when the progressive crowd say, "Oh, why has this prime minister not got this, certain number of women MPs or ethnic minority MPs or whatever at cabinet level?" What they're essentially saying is that if someone is a middle-aged white man, then by extension he's not good at his job, and I think that's absurd. So if you're saying there has to be a 50-50 quota, that means when a reshuffle comes, there's going to be white male MPs who lose their jobs solely for being white and male, and that's, in my opinion, wrong. If they're not great at the brief that they've been given, then by all means they should go. But I don't think I think it's to meet quotas. I really take issue with that, because you can imagine if the situation was reversed. If a woman cabinet minister lost her position and she was replaced by a white middle-aged male, feminists and progressives would be out and saying, "Oh, look at this! It's pure sexism, blah blah blah." It's ultimately it should be about meritocracy. Some prime ministers have very few reshuffles. Cameron had only one reshuffle, one major reshuffle during his whole 6 years in office, which is relatively little for a prime minister. Blair and Brown had quite regular reshuffles. Um, Margaret Thatcher had quite a number of reshuffles. She went through four chancellors, unless I'm mistaken, just as an example. Um, Certainly four foreign secretaries, possibly even five. So reshuffles are another area where you can have a very talented, strong minister who loses his or her job simply because of the luck of the draw. And, politics is a brutal business, and people really underestimate that politicians have to be thick skinned. Although I would say that politicians themselves, it's a case of you know what you're getting into. So no politician can plead ignorance in that, because, it's the way it is. Anyway, I'm going to round this up. Those are just some things that I want people to think about. And please don't misunderstand me. This is not like saying, oh, that we should all be subservient and praise politicians. Certainly not. All I'm saying is that people should be a little bit more open minded. And I include myself. Sometimes I've been perhaps excessively negative. They have a very difficult job. And when people say, "Oh, they're in it for themselves," I think they're ignoring that. I think they're ignoring the fact that these people, there's no other job where you're scrutinised that much. So yes, it is true that nurses and police officers and so on face a lot of pressure, but frankly, you don't get the same personal level of scrutiny. I mean, I'll give an example. When you have medical malpractice, which happens quite a lot, for the most part, individual doctors or hospital staff are not going to be named in the national press for the most part. But if an MP slips up in the tiniest little way, they're plastered all over the tabloids. And a good example of that is the way Andrew Mitchell was treated. I still believe that whole thing was blown massively out of proportion because he lost his temper and said some rude things to some police officers. Um, Sometimes we get a situation where we judge politicians to be, there's a bit of hypocrisy from the public. On one hand, we say, oh, we expect them to be professional and to be, um, squeaky clean. On the other hand, we say we want them to be like real people. And yet, as soon as they are like real people and they do something, anything short of what is expected, insofar as, if they say something that's politically incorrect, if they, then the public, by and large, want to crucify them. I don't think, incidentally, an MP should lose a job just for saying something politically incorrect. Um, But if it is something that is outright racist or sexist or, it's polarizing a large segment of the community, then they should reflect on it. And if it is genuinely racist or sexist, they should apologize. And if they don't, well, then their position should be compromised. But if it's just a case of saying that they think there's a particular problem in society and they haven't said it in a generalizing format, and so there's a lot of interesting things to focus on here. I've probably went a bit beyond the initial framework of what I was going to talk about. There's been a lot of issues here. But anyway, let me know what you think. If you are going to come out with a sweeping sort of statement like, oh, they're all the same, Nathan, you don't know what you're talking about, or whatever, the onus is on you to explain why. Because I believe that people are too often dismissive of this, and sometimes that comes into vitriolic behaviour. Sometimes. I'm a member of the public. I get pissed off with those in power as much as anyone else. I'm not going to be a hypocrite. I do. But by the same token, I try to also think, well, these people do have a really difficult job. And the level of scrutiny that they face, the general public underestimate that. Now, politicians don't get quite as much paparazzi harassment as, singers and actors do. They really get it from the paparazzi. But I get a bit annoyed when I see that journalists go right up to Jeremy Corbyn's front door or John McDonnell's front door, or they seem to be doing it more with Labour figures and Tory figures. But I think that's wrong. I think, by all means ask some questions, but to me, that's just, in my opinion, everyone deserves some degree of privacy, including politicians. They're public figures, they make decisions that impact millions of people, but that doesn't really, in my opinion, justify aggressive photographers or reporters going up to the front door and ramming a camera in their face at 8 in the morning. I take issue with that. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.